Autumn, 1943. The skies over Europe. The United States 8th Air Force is bleeding to death. Every morning, hundreds of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators roar off the runways of East Anglia. They climb into the freezing mist, forming massive combat boxes, heading for the industrial heart of Nazi Germany. And every evening, the ground crews wait for planes that never return. The losses are catastrophic. In a single week, known as Black Week, the 8th Air Force lost 148 heavy bombers. That is nearly 1,500 men, dead or captured, in just 7 days. The question wasn't if the bombers were brave. The question was why they were dying so easily. The answer lay in a fatal flaw in American military doctrine. It was a strategy that turned the most powerful fighter planes in the world into helpless spectators. It was called Close Escort, but the pilots had a different name for it: the Tethered Dog. In 1943, the primary American fighter was the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning. These were heavy, powerful machines. But the orders given to their pilots were strict, rigid, and ultimately deadly. The primary duty of the fighter is to protect the bomber. This sounded logical on paper. In practice, it was a death sentence. The orders stated that American fighter pilots were to stay tied to the bomber formation. They were not allowed to chase German aircraft. They were not allowed to roam. They were to act as a shield, not a sword. The Luftwaffe, led by experienced aces like Adolf Galland, quickly realized this. They analyzed the American tactics and found the weakness. They realized the American guard dogs were on a leash. German pilots learned that if they stayed just a few thousand feet above the American formation, or just a few miles away, they were perfectly safe. They could loiter, group up, and choose the perfect moment to strike. They would mock the American fighters. They would wiggle their wings, taunting the P-47s, knowing the Americans were forbidden to pursue them. Captain Don Gentile, who would later become a legend, described the rage of the American pilots during this period. He spoke of sitting in his cockpit, shaking with fury, watching German fog. Autumn, 1943. The skies over Europe. The United States 8th Air Force is bleeding to death. Every morning, hundreds of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators roar off the runways of East Anglia. They climb into the freezing mist, forming massive combat boxes, heading for the industrial heart of Nazi Germany. And every evening, the ground crews wait for planes that never return. The losses are catastrophic. In a single week, known as Black Week, the 8th Air Force lost 148 heavy bombers. That is nearly 1,500 men, dead or captured, in just 7 days. The question wasn't if the bombers were brave. The question was why they were dying so easily. The answer lay in a fatal flaw in American military doctrine. It was a strategy that turned the most powerful fighter planes in the world into helpless spectators. It was called Close Escort, but the pilots had a different name for it: the Tethered Dog. In 1943, the primary American fighter was the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning. These were heavy, powerful machines. But the orders given to their pilots were strict, rigid, and ultimately deadly. The primary duty of the fighter is to protect the bomber. This sounded logical on paper. In practice, it was a death sentence. The orders stated that American fighter pilots were to stay tied to the bomber formation. They were not allowed to chase German aircraft. They were not allowed to roam. They were to act as a shield, not a sword. The Luftwaffe, led by experienced aces like Adolf Galland, quickly realized this. They analyzed the American tactics and found the weakness. They realized the American guard dogs were on a leash. German pilots learned that if they... January 6, 1944. High Wycombe, England. A new commander steps out of a staff car at the headquarters of the 8th Air Force. He is a short man, barely 5'6". He is balding. He looks more like a university professor than a warrior. But the ribbons on his chest tell a different story. This is Major General James Jimmy Doolittle. He is already a living legend. He is the man who led the suicidal Doolittle raid on Tokyo in 1942, proving that Japan could be hit. He is a master of calculated risk. And General Eisenhower has sent him to England with a single brutal mandate: fix the air war. When Doolittle arrives, the 8th Air Force is demoralized. The bomber crews are near mutiny from the losses. The fighter pilots are frustrated. On his first inspection tour of 8 Fighter Command, Doolittle walks into the office of Major General William Kepner. On the wall, prominently displayed for every pilot to see, is a sign. It represents the standing order of the entire Air Force. It reads, "The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." Doolittle stares at the sign. To him, those words are not a strategy. They are a confession of failure. He realizes immediately why the Germans are winning. The Americans are playing defense. In Doolittle's mind, you cannot win a war by catching bullets. You win by shooting the man holding the gun. He turns to General Kepner and points at the sign. "Take that damn thing down," Doolittle orders. He then issues a new directive. It is a sentence that will change the course of World War II. It is simple, aggressive, and terrifyingly clear. The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy the enemy Air Force. The room goes silent. This was not just a change of words. It was a revolution. Doolittle was effectively saying, "Stop protecting the bombers. Start hunting the Germans." The reaction was immediate and explosive. When the order filtered down to the bomber crews, the men in the B-17s and B-24s, they were horrified. They felt betrayed. For years, their only comfort had been seeing the P-47s flying close formation, right off their wings. Now, the new general was telling the fighters to leave them, to fly away and chase the Germans. "They are abandoning us," the bomber crews said. "We are just bait." And in a cruel, calculated way, Doolittle knew they were right. The bombers were the bait. Doolittle argued that the close escort tactic was a fallacy. By hugging the bombers, the American fighters surrendered the initiative. They let the Germans choose when and how to fight. Doolittle wanted to turn the tables. He wanted the Mustangs and Thunderbolts to attack the Luftwaffe before they even got close to the bomber stream. "I don't want you to wait for them to attack," Doolittle told his fighter group commanders. "I want you to find them. I want you to chase them. And I don't want you to come home until you've killed them." This was the doctrine of ultimate pursuit. Until this moment, if a German fighter dived away, the American pilot had to let him go. Under Doolittle's new rules, the American pilot was ordered to follow him. If the German climbed, you climbed. If the German dove to the deck, you dove. If the German ran back to Berlin, you followed him to Berlin. The leash was cut. The fighter pilots, men like Don Gentile and George Preddy, were ecstatic. They had been flying with one hand tied behind their backs. Now the mad general had just handed them a license to kill. But the transition would be bloody. Doolittle's strategy was reckless. It left the bombers temporarily exposed in exchange for long-term air superiority. He was gambling thousands of lives on the belief that January 6, 1944, High Wycombe, England. A new commander steps out of a staff car at the headquarters of the 8th Air Force. February 1944. General Jimmy Doolittle had issued the order, "Destroy the Luftwaffe." But an order is just words on paper. To execute it, he needed a weapon. He needed a machine that could do the impossible. For 2 years, the air war had been defined by geography. The Spitfire and the Thunderbolt were magnificent fighters, but they were short-legged. They could escort the bombers to the edge of Germany, but then they had to turn back. Beyond that line, the German pilots were kings. They called it the Reichsdefense. They knew exactly where the American fighters had to turn around. They would wait at that invisible line, watching the P-47s bank for home, and then they would descend on the bombers like wolves on sheep. But in the winter of 1944, a new shape appeared in the sky. It was slim, silver, and aerodynamic. It had a unique belly scoop and a laminar flow wing. It was the North American P-51 Mustang. Shutterstock. Originally, the Mustang was a mediocre scout plane. But then, engineers had the brilliant idea to marry the American airframe with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The result was alchemy. The Mustang was faster than the Focke-Wulf 190, could outturn the Messerschmitt 109, could dive like a stone. But speed wasn't the weapon. The weapon was range. Under its wings, the P-51 carried two 75-gallon drop tanks. They were made of compressed paper or aluminum. They looked ugly, but they held the fuel of victory. With these tanks, the Mustang didn't just go to the border. Could go to Berlin, could go to Poland, and it could come back. Doolittle saw this plane, and he knew. This is the sword. He immediately implemented his doctrine of ultimate pursuit. The first time the Luftwaffe encountered this, it was a shock that shattered their reality. It is late February. Big week. Operation Argument. The Allies launch massive raids to lure the German Air Force into the sky. Deep over central Germany, a squadron of Bf-109s is forming up. They are 300 miles from the French coast. They are relaxed. They believe they are untouchable. Their flight leader radios the attack plan. They prepare to dive on the B-17s. Suddenly, the radio crackles with panic. Achtung! Indians! Indians at 6 o'clock. The German pilots look back. Diving out of the sun are silver fighters. It's impossible, the German leader thinks. Spitfires can't be here. Thunderbolts can't be here. But the silver planes drop their external tanks. The tanks tumble away, sparking in the sunlight. Now clean and aerodynamic, the P-51s accelerate to 440 miles per hour. They don't just screen the bombers. They attack. Doolittle's pilots, men like Don Blakesley, push their throttles to the firewall. They tear through the German formation. And when the Germans dive to escape, a tactic that had worked for years, the Mustangs dive with them. Down, down, down. From 25,000 feet to the treetops. The German pilots realize with horror that they cannot shake this new enemy. The Mustang hangs on their tail like a grim reaper. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, had once boasted that enemy fighters would never fly over the Reich. When he saw reports of downed P-51s deep in Bavaria, he reportedly whispered, "The war is lost." The Mustang changed the geometry of the war. There was no longer a front line in the sky. Every inch of air over Germany from the Rhine to the Oder was now a killing zone. Doolittle used the bombers as bait. He dangled the B-17s out there, waiting for the Luftwaffe to rise. And when they did, the Mustangs were waiting in the sun, ready to execute the new order. The hunter had become the hunted. The reach of the 8th Air Force was no longer limited by fuel. It was limited only by how far the Germans could run. March 1944. The dogfight at 20,000 feet is over. The bombers are safely on their way back to England. The fuel gauges on the P-51 Mustangs are dropping. By all the old rules of warfare, the mission should be finished. The pilots should go home. But General Jimmy Doolittle had rewritten the rulebook. He looked at the statistics. He realized that the Luftwaffe was hiding. When the American fighter sweeps came through, the Germans simply stayed on the ground. They refused to take off. They were preserving their strength. Doolittle's response was cold and ruthless. If they won't come up to fight you, go down and dig them out. This was the beginning of the strafing campaign. And for the American pilots, it was the most terrifying order they had ever received. Fighting at high altitude is clean. It is a duel of skill. But strafing? Strafing is dirty. It is dangerous. It is suicidal. To strafe an airfield, a pilot has to drop from the safety of the clouds to the deck. He has to fly his Mustang at 400 miles per hour, just 10 feet above the grass. At that height, you are not fighting another pilot. You are fighting everything. You are fighting 20mm flak towers that surround the airfield. You are fighting soldiers with rifles. You are fighting telephone poles, church steeples, and trees. One mistake, one twitch of the wrist, and you are a smear on the German countryside. But Doolittle insisted. He wanted the Luftwaffe destroyed, and he didn't care if it happened in the air or on the concrete. The tactic was brutal. American squadrons would roam deep into Germany, hunting for airfields. When they found one, they would descend like a swarm of locusts. They caught the Germans sleeping. They caught mechanics refueling planes. They caught pilots sitting in their cockpits, warming up their engines. The .50 caliber machine guns of the Mustangs would tear through the parked aircraft. Fuel trucks exploded. Hangars burned. In minutes, an entire Jägerschwader fighter wing could be reduced to scrap metal without ever leaving the ground. But the most controversial and effective part of this strategy was vulching. Vulching meant catching the enemy when he was most vulnerable, taking off or landing. A German pilot might survive a terrifying battle with the bombers. He would return to his base, exhausted, low on fuel, his ammunition gone. He would drop his landing gear and lower his flaps. He was seconds away from safety. He was thinking about a hot meal and a cigarette. And then, out of nowhere, a P-51 would scream across the runway. There was no sport in it. A plane with its gear down cannot maneuver. It is a sitting duck. The Mustangs would shred them on the approach. German planes were shot down just feet above their own runways. They were destroyed while taxiing to their hangars. The Luftwaffe pilots began to develop a deep, paralyzing neurosis. In the past, the airfield was a sanctuary. It was home. Now home was a death trap. Adolf Galland, the general of fighters, received reports of his best men dying not in heroic dogfights, but being burned alive in their cockpits while parked on the tarmac. The attrition was unsustainable. Germany could build more Bf-109s. Their factories were actually increasing production, but they could not build more pilots. A German ace took 2 years to train. Doolittle's strategy was killing them faster than they could be replaced. The strafing campaign turned the hunters into the hunted. It stripped the Luftwaffe of its safe harbor. It sent a message to every German airman. You are not safe in the air. You are not safe on the ground. You are not safe anywhere. It was reckless for the Americans, too. The 8th Air Force lost more top aces to ground fire while strafing than they did to German fighters. Legends like Gentile and Godfrey were nearly killed or captured hitting airfields. But the math worked. By April 1944, the back of the Luftwaffe was broken. Not because they ran out of planes, but because they had nowhere left to hide. May 1944. The fields of France are blooming. The English Channel is calm. The world is holding its breath. Everyone knows the invasion is coming. In the headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, General Dwight D. Eisenhower is pacing. He looks at the maps of Normandy. He knows that the greatest amphibious assault in history, Operation Overlord, is a massive gamble. If the German Luftwaffe appears in force over the beaches on D-Day, it will be a slaughter. The landing craft are slow. The beaches are crowded. A few hundred German fighters could turn Omaha Beach into a graveyard in minutes. Eisenhower turns to his air commanders. He asks the question that keeps him awake at night. Can you guarantee air superiority? Thanks to Jimmy Doolittle, the answer was yes. What Eisenhower couldn't fully see from his map room, the German General Adolf Galland saw clearly from his cockpit. The Luftwaffe was dead. Doolittle's reckless strategy of ultimate pursuit and airfield strafing had worked with brutal efficiency. In the 4 months between January and May 1944, the German fighter force had been hollowed out. They had lost over 2,200 pilots. But it wasn't just the number, it was the quality. The experten, the veterans with iron crosses and years of combat experience were gone. They had been hunted down by the Mustangs, killed on the way to work, killed on the runway, killed in the air. Replacing them was a tragedy. The new German pilots were children. They were teenagers with barely 10 hours of flight time in a combat fighter. They were sent up against American pilots who had hundreds of hours of training and the best aircraft in the world. It wasn't a fight anymore. It was target practice. There is a famous joke that circulated among the German infantry in France during this time. A soldier asks his sergeant how to identify the planes overhead. The sergeant replies, "If the plane is silver, it's American. If the plane is dark, it's British. And if the plane is invisible, it's the Luftwaffe." Then came the morning of June 6, 1944, D-Day. The sun rose over an ocean filled with 5,000 Allied ships. The sky was painted with black and white invasion stripes on every Allied aircraft. 12,000 Allied sorties were flown that day. And the Germans? This is the ultimate statistic of Doolittle's victory. On the most important day of the war for the Third Reich, the Luftwaffe managed to fly fewer than 300 sorties. Over the invasion beaches themselves, only 2 German fighter planes appeared. 2. Joseph Pips Priller and his wingman, Heinz Wudersick, flew a single strafing run over Sword Beach. They came in low, fired their guns in a gesture of defiance, and ran for their lives. That was it. The mighty Luftwaffe, which had terrorized Europe for 5 years, had been reduced to 2 planes making a symbolic pass. The Allied soldiers on the beaches looked up, waiting for the bombs to fall, but the sky remained empty of enemies. The supplies flowed. The tanks landed. The beachhead was secured. General Jimmy Doolittle's strategy had been called mad. It had been called reckless. His own bomber crews had cursed him for abandoning them. But history delivered the verdict. By unleashing the fighters, by authorizing the vulching of airfields, and by accepting high casualties in the short term, Doolittle had achieved total air supremacy when it mattered most. He had destroyed the Luftwaffe before the invasion even began. Years later, Adolf Galland, the man who fought against Doolittle's Mustangs, wrote the final epitaph for the German Air Force. He recalled the day he looked out over Berlin and saw American fighters flying freely over the capital of the Reich. "The day I saw the Mustangs deep inside Germany," Galland said, "I knew then that the war was lost. The sign in the headquarters had been right all along. The first duty was to destroy the enemy, and they had done it.